All right, Candy fans, as promised, I am about to air the footage that I shot at MJBizCon from the Investor Luncheon. Key guest speaker was Kris Krane from Forefront Ventures. That guy's done a lot of work with Normal over the years, and now his organization kind of keeps tabs on the financial end and what's going on in the cannabis industry, as well as the hemp industry. And they're kind of like, I don't know, I guess I would describe them as analysts of sorts, financial analysts that are really focusing on the marijuana game. And so I'm going to put up the speech in the 3 segments that I was able to film it in. It is a little choppy. It is a little far away from, obviously, right up stage. I mean, not too far away, but just shooting it with my cell phone that I had at the time is the best footage I could get. But I think the information that he put out was really, really good. And the key takeaways that I got out of it were really just that, the big companies lost so much money this year in stocks and this, that, and the other thing, largely due to overvaluating their companies, putting them on the public exchange, raising capital, and then taking that money and investing it in new places that they were predicting would do well. But at the end of the day, what ends up happening is, guess what? It's tough to grow weed, and it's tough to grow it efficiently, and it's tough to grow it efficiently under the thumb of compliance. So what happened was a lot of these places, even though they had great spots and the best facilities money could buy, they just didn't have the right team in place actually growing the product or driving the company forward with the right the right mission. And so I think that was the big takeaway that I got out of it, and it's something that I've been saying for a long time. These people that have these large marijuana grows all over the country, a lot of them just had a shit ton of money and they had the connections, but they don't know anything about growing and they've never really done it. And so, to put $20 million into a business that you don't know how to do yourself is kind of crazy, and you're completely at the mercy of whoever you hire for your team. So super important to get the right team, and I happen to know just the guys, if anyone's looking. But anyway, with no further ado, here is Kris Krane from Forefront Ventures from the MJBizCon Investor Luncheon 2019.
But also, so is how you execute within that geography. So is your strategy, so is your executional capability. In other words, it's not enough to just focus on acquiring licenses. You need to focus on building a team and capacity to execute on those assets. Now, there were a number of us that were saying that the valuations that we were seeing, which were largely based on speculation, were unsustainable, and that eventually the cannabis markets were going to be valued according to the same performance metrics as just about any other industry. And that's largely where we find ourselves today. So it brings us back to the current state of cannabis valuations, especially in the public markets here. And you can see I like board games. So we're at our kind of what we call the day of reckoning. The markets have now shifted from valuing shifted to valuing actual performance metrics over speculation, and that hasn't been particularly kind to the cannabis capital markets. And we've seen many of these companies' valuations now go down by as much as 3/4 of their worth from what we saw this time last year. Now, much of this, to be fair, has been driven by the performance of the Canadian LPs. They are still, by far, the largest driver of what's happening in the cannabis capital markets globally, including here in the United States. The Canadian companies still have high valuations that are high enough to have a major impact on the entire market. And unfortunately, the Canadian LPs have largely been performing pretty poorly against the 2019 and 2020 projections that they put out there to the capital markets and sold their investors on back in 2015, 2016, 2017 when they were out raising a lot of the early capital. And so now chickens are coming home to roost. We haven't seen those metrics met, and so we've seen a devaluation of some of these Canadian stocks. It spooked a lot of Canadian institutional investors that drive these valuations, and so now what we're seeing is a lot of the capital that was coming into the industry over the last couple of years was coming in from Canada. And it was Canadian retail investors, Canadian institutional investors that were investing in the LPs, investing in the MSOs. And they're largely on the sidelines now. The attitude, for the most part, amongst Canadian institutional investment today is we're going to sit this out for a little while and figure out who actually knows what they're doing here. It's not a unwise strategy, frankly. But the downturn means that acquisitions are likely going to slow, and they already have. Right, so it's now much more expensive to access capital at these low valuations. It's much more dilutive to go out and raise money, and of course using your paper now to go acquire assets is also much more dilutive. So you're just not seeing the type of M&A sprees today that we were seeing before we saw this downturn. It's even worse for some companies that use their inflated paper to buy all these assets without focusing on the ability to execute and execute against them. There are some companies out there, we believe, and most of it's not public info, with dozens of assets across the United States that were bought primarily using stock and equity that still have to be built out. The vast majority of these projects aren't being built, and the capex costs on building out cultivation facilities, in particular production facilities, is incredibly expensive. And we believe that there are companies out there that have somewhere between $250 million and $500 million in unfunded assets on their books. And given today's relatively low valuations, it's going to be really difficult to raise that much money without taking massive dilution. And of course, if you're actually trying to build out these facilities, right, general contractors are not going to take stock to go and build out your grow and build out your HVAC systems and build out your production facilities, right? They want cash, they want capital. And so this is part of the reason for folks who've been following this that we've seen a lot of more creative type of funding, particularly to fund capex costs. We've seen a lot more REIT deals and sale-leaseback deals that often come with fairly high interest rates. But they're non-dilutive to the company owners. And in the cannabis industry, because in the United States still, we don't have access to institutional capital, we can't take a license in a limited state and say, look, there's very little risk. If we can build this thing out, there's very little risk that this business is going to fail because we only have 15 competitors in a state of 20 million people, in a state like Florida, for example. In fact, just about any bank would provide a loan in any other industry to fund the capex costs to build out that facility. That's not available in the United States, so we need to look to alternative sources of financing like sale-leasebacks, like REIT funding, real estate funding being the primary driver as essentially an alternative to institutional capital and lending. And we're likely going to see, and we've already started to see a little bit of it over the next year, companies beginning to sell off assets. As they begin to take a hard look at which of these assets are really going to drive real revenue and which may just become an operational burden. A couple of years ago, it was a lot easier to justify putting money into developing your assets in a state that you thought may have a 2 to 4 year time horizon before it becomes a robust medical market or even adult use market. Today, it's very hard when you have a much more limited pool of capital available to you. It's much more difficult to justify spending any of that capital on assets in places that may not be cash flow positive for 3, 4, 5, sometimes years or even more. So, because so many companies rushed in to get public in Canada over the past year or so, many are now finding it difficult to raise capital at all. And over the next year, it's likely that we're going to see some companies, and I would venture to say including some higher profile multi-state operators in the US, effectively go under or become officially distressed over the course of 2020. It's going to be very interesting to see how this works for companies that does happen to, because we don't have bankruptcy protections in the United States. You can't go to bankruptcy court and get this all worked out in bankruptcy court, so how this works with debtors is going to be very interesting to see how this plays out. My guess is it's going to be a slew of lawsuits in both state and federal court to try and figure out what to do about all this debt that companies aren't going to be able to pay back. But for those who do have access to capital in this space, for those companies that are able to make it through this, and I'm going to be done with the doom and gloom here in a minute and get on to the opportunities, but I think it's important context for understanding where we are as a market. But for those who are able to access capital and who are wise about how they deploy it, I think there's going to be great opportunities to expand their footprint for relatively cheap prices, because I think there's going to be a distressed asset sell-off over the course of 2020. So as I mentioned, the little institutional capital in the space, has mostly been Canadian, is now kind of on the sidelines waiting to see who can execute against their asset base. The question is no longer how many licenses do you have and in which states are those licenses in. Companies now need to demonstrate that they can execute, drive real revenue, and start hitting revenue projections over the course of 2020 and 2021. Now, doing so is going to require a major focus on execution. And executing well is difficult and requires a mastery of various operational expertise across all verticals in the cannabis industry. So a lot of people have likened what's currently happening in the cannabis industry to the end of the internet bubble in the late 1990s. And I think there's some true and fair parallels there. At the height of the internet bubble, there were tons of companies enjoying sky-high valuations that were based largely on speculation over who was going to win the internet. It's not too different than what we saw over the last couple of years here, with speculations over who was going to win marijuana. But when that bubble eventually burst, focus turned to which companies had a sound business model, a good management team, and an ability to execute against their business plan. The question now for the cannabis industry is which companies out there are Amazon, Google, and Apple, all of whom existed at the height of the internet boom and during the crash, and who's Pets.com. So as a potential investor in cannabis, how do you know what to look for in a potential cannabis investment? And the answer, I think, is actually more simple than most people realize, and it frankly isn't all that different than looking at an investment in any other industry. You want to make sure that the companies that you're looking at, have a great team in place that you can trust to execute and a proven ability to operate. Make sure that the team was built for their operational capabilities and not just their ability to play the M&A game. M&A is important. It's not to say companies shouldn't be out there acquiring assets. There are lots of reasons to do so. We've done some M&A ourselves. But if your company is built around an M&A strategy, I think for the foreseeable future, that's going to cause considerable challenges. I would strongly suggest looking at teams that are really built for executional capability, that have great management teams, that know how to drive revenue, particularly in competitive markets. From an operator standpoint, I think there's no better test than having operated at scale in highly competitive markets. So this, I believe, provides a distinct advantage for companies that have really won out in the most highly competitive markets in the United States. And I would look at places in particular like Washington, Oregon, Colorado, California to a lesser degree because they're going through a pretty big transition into a new regulated market. But these are markets where you have a lot of competitors, lots of licensees, and massive downward price compression. Wholesale pricing in places like Washington, Oregon, even Colorado are a fraction of what they are in a lot of these limited license states. So in contrast, many of these companies that have focused exclusively on limited license markets that were used to drive valuations have never really had to face really stiff competition and operational adversity. After all, if you could sell a high-quality indoor pound of cannabis for $3,500 a pound, which is going great in a lot of these limited license states, in places like Illinois, Massachusetts, Florida, elsewhere, you're looking at $2,500 upwards of, in some places, $4,500 a pound. If you have operational challenges, you can throw resources at the problem, you can throw money at the problem, and you're going to figure it out. But if you're in a state like Washington, that same high-quality indoor-produced pound sells for $750 a pound wholesale. If you're trying to sell $750 a pound wholesale high-quality indoor pounds, there simply are not margins there to spend resources on this kind of problem solving. Instead, you need to focus on producing the best quality products at the lowest possible price point. And companies that have proven the ability to do that in these highly competitive markets are going to be really well positioned as the industry opens up, especially post-federal prohibition and interstate commerce. And we've already seen, as I mentioned, major price compression in some of these highly competitive states across the US. So think about what's going to happen when federal legalization comes to an end on the cultivation side of the business in particular, especially for anybody who's not growing high quality connoisseur quality craft grade cannabis. So there's always going to be a market for that, and there's always going to be domestic producers that can produce the best quality, just like there is in most other industries. But that's a small segment of the market. Right? It's about 10% or so of the states can have a really hard time maintaining those. Now, that's not to say that some of those big indoor grows in some of those eastern states aren't good investments. You just have to understand the state dynamics. Right? In a state like Massachusetts or Illinois, for example, where you're going to probably have 2 to 3 years of major product shortages, in those states, you can spend $20 million building out a large-scale cultivation facility, and you're probably going to have a 2 to 3 year window where you're going to make that money back in your first year. You're going to make a whole lot of profit. You just need to recognize that spigot's probably going to get turned off at some point once we can start bringing in cheap product from Oregon and Washington, and even more so, this opens up federal legalization, likely opens up international commerce, not just interstate commerce. This likely means that within sometime in the next decade, should international commerce open up, which it likely will, most of the biomass used to produce infused products, final products, edibles, vape pens, etc., is largely going to come from low-cost agricultural countries, places like Mexico and Colombia. Right? 90% of the cut flowers sold in the United States are grown in Colombia. Most of the commercial agriculture consumed in the United States is grown in greenhouses in Mexico or outdoors in Mexico. And it's because commercial agriculture is a lot cheaper to do there. Same thing here. It's going to be cheaper to grow in low-cost producer countries than it's going to be to grow in the United States or to grow in Canada. And if you're not growing for the quality of the flower, you're just growing it to extract it and run it through a machine and turn it into oil, I believe that most of the biomass is ultimately going to come from these low-cost producer countries. So we want to be really careful about getting into large-scale, particularly large-scale outdoor commercial agriculture in the United States, because you're going to have a lot of competition both inside the country and outside the country. You're also going to see incredible price compression. And if we've seen this kind of price compression in a state like Washington with 7 million people, self-contained where nothing can cross state lines, what do you think is going to happen when you can build efficiencies of scale to sell to the entire country or to sell into an entire country internationally? Our chief investment officer at Forefront, my partner Andrew Toot, likes to say that focusing on large-scale cultivation is kind of like trying to play the end of alcohol prohibition by becoming a hop farmer. Right? You don't really want to be a hop farmer. You want to control brands and distribution. Right? That's the part of the value chain that holds the value. It's not to say there's not money to be made in cultivation, but if you're looking to do large-scale production for biomass, probably better off looking in places like Colombia than you are even in a place like California. So while it's true that ultimately branded products are going to hold their value a lot better than I believe flower will, and we've seen this already in states where we have seen price compression, you do see brands hold their value quite a bit better. People are willing to pay a little bit more for branded infused products generally than they are for flower once flower becomes abundant. I don't believe that brands matter all that much in the cannabis industry today. And we've seen this in markets where there isn't a whole lot of brand loyalty in the cannabis market today. Now, there are some specialty products where I think that this is not a universal statement. I think there are products where people want to have a real connection with the product that they're getting. I would look at a company like Foria, for example, which produces basically sexual aid products, lubes and suppositories and stuff like that. Right? That's not really the kind of thing you want to bargain shop for. You probably want to have a brand that you really trust. But if you're talking about buying a 10 milligram gummy square, if somebody can put a packet of gummies on the market that is $10 cheaper than everything else that's currently available at a dispensary, there's not a lot of customers that are going to maintain their loyalty to the gummy that they've been buying when they can buy a product that's just as good for a cheaper price. So there's a lot of movement now amongst consumers from brand to brand as they figure out which are going to be the brands they're most loyal to. And I believe that this is largely driven by who's able to produce the best quality products or good quality product at the lowest possible price point. It's efficient operations at scale. So, just by way of example here, a lot of companies have spent large sums of money developing fancy branding and fancy packaging, and I'll give you a case study of a company called Northwest Cannabis Solutions. Full disclosure, we have an affiliation with them. So, just another way we've seen people actually make money. I like mentioning this one because I think it's one that not a lot of folks think about when they think about how can we make money on investments in the cannabis industry. But this is a bit of a higher risk, but also high reward opportunity in terms of what I call license procurement. So if we ask the question, who's actually made money in the cannabis industry today? As in like real money in their pockets. It's not the owners of the large MSOs, it's not really the owner of the large Canadian LPs. These companies have the largest market caps, and they are absolutely poised to be some of the biggest winners in the long term. When we look at ultimately who has made the most in cannabis, it's probably going to come from the ranks of the larger MSOs and Canadian LPs, for sure. But in terms of who's made the most money today, it's largely been what I like to call license originators. And by that I mean people who went out and won licenses largely in limited license states and competitive markets. These are people who tended to have some combination of good app writing ability, good business experience, and sometimes most importantly, really good political connections within their state and an ability to navigate the local political environment. And they were able to use those capabilities to go out and win licenses. These are things that are difficult, by and large, even for some of the largest MSOs, the largest players in the space, especially when they're going into states or markets or countries now, where they may be viewed as, they're unfamiliar with the political environment, they may be viewed as carpetbaggers. It's difficult to go into a state as an outsider and just come in and win a license right away. It happens plenty, but it's challenging. There's a lot of people who are local, who have the experience and have the connections that are going to go out and win those licenses. And those license originators, many of them then turned around and sold them to some of the largest players in the space. Like we talked about this M&A spree. That's who this money went to. It was the people that won the licenses in their states and then essentially flipped them to some of the larger players. And in many cases, they pocketed millions of dollars without actually having to execute on anything other than winning a license. They didn't have to go and execute on a very difficult business model. They didn't have to go out and compete in the market with more experienced operators. They were able to make millions in many cases by just winning a license and selling it to a company that wanted to get into their space and didn't win one on their own. Now, moving forward, many of the states that are about to license are still going to have limited licenses. Many states have preference for locals, and in particular, certainly one of the biggest trends we're seeing, and there is happy to have a much longer conversation about the social justice rationale for why this is so important, but in most of the states that are now starting to legalize through the state legislature, these tend to be progressive states, very diverse states, with very powerful Black caucuses, Latino caucuses, who are much better educated on this issue than they were just a few years ago. And so these laws are including very, very strong social equity provisions to the point where in a state like Illinois, for example, they're only going to be issuing 70 new dispensary licenses and 40 new craft cultivator licenses, and it is going to be virtually impossible to win a license in one of these states if you don't qualify as a social equity applicant. For those who don't know what that means, that typically means people from communities that were disproportionately impacted by cannabis prohibition, people who have cannabis arrests on their record, people who have been harmed by the war on marijuana and the war on drugs, now are given a leg up in licensing, and in some cases actually effectively, exclusively are going to be the winners of these upcoming licenses. So it creates great opportunities for folks to get into this space, also creates opportunities for new license originators who might want to win a license and not actually have to execute what is ultimately a very difficult business. They're creating avenues for wealth generation for communities that have been most harmed by the drug war and the war on marijuana prohibition. So to sum things up here, again, the day of speculation driving company valuations, I think, is largely over. Right? That bubble has burst, and that's a good thing. Right? For those of us, and my company is a publicly traded company, we have been negatively impacted by this like everybody else, but I feel very confident in our ability to go out and execute and focus on execution and focus on operations, and I think the companies that are able to do that are going to be in a good position, and ultimately this calling out period of lower valuations is going to be a good thing for the industry. It's also a really good time to buy, I believe, to buy into cannabis stocks. But be very cautious when you're looking, right? It's not a speculative game. If you're going to buy into the cannabis stock market today, you really want to look for those companies that have placed a real emphasis on being able to operate efficiently, to being able to operate efficiently at scale, and to be able to operate efficiently at scale across markets, and to navigate these different regulatory environments. So, the industry and its investors have now matured to the point where companies with these great executional capabilities and the top operating teams that can produce great products and drive real revenue are ultimately going to win the day. So when looking for these opportunities, right, this is where you want to look to put your money. Again, good news is stock prices are really low. And if we legalize in another dozen states or so over the course of the next year, we get the States Act passed at the federal level, maybe get federal legalization passed in 2021 or 2022, there's a very good chance that we're going to see a major spike in values, but I believe that spike will be tied to those companies that really know how to execute and know how to operate. So I think it's a good time to get in and invest in some of the public companies, as long as you're being more cautious about who you're doing it with. And so just to kind of finish this up here, what do you look for in operations? Battle-tested operating team. Have they done it, and have they done it in highly competitive markets? Focus on operations over acquiring licenses. The ability to fund capacity for licenses in hand. So how many licenses does the company have? Where are those licenses? And how much is it going to cost for them to build that out? And do they have that capital? And do they have line of sight to that capital? And if they don't have line of sight to all of that capital, that's okay. How are they going to prioritize the capital that they have? Which projects are most important for them to focus on? Have them justify why those projects are the most important ones, which ones are going to drive revenue and drive EBITDA, and which ones can you maybe put on hold for the next 6 months to a year until you're able to generate more revenue, generate more capital, and put money back into those other projects that are revenue drivers but may not move the needle as much as your priority projects. So make sure you understand those. Ability to raise capital. Have they been able to go out and raise capital before? Have they raised capital for their company? Have they raised capital in tough capital markets environments before? And then a feasible plan to achieve profitability. So how do they plan to get to cash flow positive? How do they plan to get to profitability? And do they have a plan in place to execute against that? I think you could take most of these suggestions and apply them in just about every industry. And I think that, again, is back to the good part of the industry coming back down to earth a little bit, is it's now down to the same kind of things that you would probably look at when looking at just about any other industry. Good fundamentals, good line of sight on profitability, great operations, great team. It's not rocket science, but unfortunately, I think in the boom time that was kind of largely lost in the capital markets, and now we're back to a place where those companies that can do well or that can execute well are going to do well in this space. And there's a lot of blue sky ahead for those who are able to do that. And so with that, I think I'm gonna leave it there. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to open up for questions.
All right, guys, hope everyone liked Kris Krane's speech. I found it super educational in terms of the state of marijuana. Again, my key takeaways were that if you're looking to invest money in the marijuana business somewhere in the country, Massachusetts is probably the safest place to be. We have an awesome market here, and I've got a great grow team poised and ready to be put to work. So we're looking to raise some capital, and if anyone out there is looking to get in the game, you know how to find me. Thanks again, Kris Krane, for a great presentation. And until next time, guys, this is the Candyman telling you to grow hard or go home, baby.